I want to welcome you to Courageous Parents Network's event, our first In the Room since we took a little break over the summer. We are beginning our fall programming with the topic of feeding and feeding challenges. For any parent or caregiver or clinician who takes care of a child living with serious illness or medical complexity, you know very well that one of the first things and a chronic thing that caregivers wrestle with in taking care of and loving the child is keeping them well nourished. And that can get very complicated and change over time. And with the technical challenges also can come a lot of emotion and confusion and stress. And we're very lucky to have with us tonight Dr. Dana Bakula, who will introduce herself, she's a pediatric psychologist who specializes in supporting caregivers wrestling with feeding challenges for their child. And mother and parent advocate Nicole Crump, who will also introduce herself and let me just say about Nicole has lived the whole gambit with her child, so can pretty much speak to all facets of a lot, having been going through this for a long time. So truly, you can ask Nicole and Dana anything, and we at Courageous Parents Network feel very lucky to have you. So without further ado, I hand it over to Dana to introduce herself, and then Nicole, if you would introduce yourself, and then begin the slide deck. And actually, maybe Dana, if you would bring up the slide deck and start sharing your screen, and then just on the title slide, you can introduce yourself, and then we'll go. Thank you, everyone.
Perfect. Just let me go ahead and start sharing.
Perfect.
Okay. Do you see the slides or do you see the?
No, we see perfect.
Beautiful. Okay. So thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Blythe. We're super glad to be here and talking about when it's harder than it should be, navigating the emotional toll of your child's feeding challenges. So as Blythe said, my name is Dana Bakula. I'm a pediatric psychologist, and I'm the co-director of the Interdisciplinary Feeding and Swallowing Program at Children's Mercy in Kansas City. And Nicole, I'll let you introduce yourself, and then we have a little bit more information about us on the next slide too.
Hi, I'm Nicole Crump. I am the parent of an 8-year-old daughter with an ultra-rare disease that results essentially in profound cerebral palsy. I also am the LIND Administrative Assistant at the University of Kansas Medical Center, LIND standing for Leadership, Education, and Neurodevelopmental and Related Disabilities. So I have a personal and professional vested interest in disability and the well-being of caregivers.
Great. So as I said, I'm a pediatric psychologist, but I'm also a researcher. And so throughout my week, part of the week I spend in clinic working with families in our pediatric feeding program. But then I also spend a significant amount of my week working on research to help improve the quality of care that we offer children with feeding difficulties or feeding challenges, but also specifically in supporting caregivers and parents in taking care of themselves. I started out my training as a pediatric psychologist, so excited to work with kids and work with kids with complex medical needs. And just throughout my training and my career, I have just become so passionate about supporting parents and caregivers, because there's such a significant impact on parents and caregivers when your children are struggling to meet their basic needs, to feed, have complex medical needs. And as a pediatric healthcare system, we don't do a great job of supporting the caregiver. And we know that how caregivers are doing is so tied to how children are doing. So that's something that I do a lot of work focused on, is specifically how do we improve the quality of life for our children with feeding difficulties, both from supporting them in their feeding needs, but also in supporting their parents and caregivers, and how do we improve that quality of care. And Nicole, I'll let you give a little bit more information about yourself too.
Sure, thank you. So first and foremost, I'm a mom. I have 2 children. My eldest is a female with a rare genetic disorder. My youngest is a boy who is neurotypical. And I was really thrust into this rare disease parenting role hard and fast. And it changed everything about the way I live, the work that I do. I have become a strong advocate for both rare disease, caregiver well-being, among other things over the years. And that advocacy has taken a lot of different forms and has kind of ebbed and flowed with what I've got going on in my life. And I'm happy now to be at the University of Kansas and to know Dana. I know Dana because she was my daughter's clinician who took care of not just my daughter, but also of me, and was the first clinician to ever ask how I was doing. It really resonated, and we are lucky now to collaborate together on a lot of this work. And my research and project focus is caregiver well-being and providing respite for families in the Kansas City metro area.
Great. Thank you, Nicole. So we want to talk about why feeding, right? Like, why is this a topic that we're talking about today? And the things that we were thinking a lot about, why is feeding so emotional? Why does this matter so much for parents and caregivers in your own well-being and that emotional impact? Comes down to a lot of factors, but we boiled them down to feeding is keeping your child alive, which is incredibly important as a parent. Feeding is helping your child grow. Feeding is bonding with your child. Feeding is joyful. It's such a positive experience that we have with children. Feeding is cultural. It is tied to our families, our culture, where we grow up, how we communicate and connect with those around us. And feeding is family time, right? Like, we think a lot about feeding as this time that we spend with our children and our family. And so that all is really connected to our emotions. And that is really why feeding can be so tied to parent and caregiver emotions. When I first got involved in this work and working with children with feeding difficulties, I was working with a psychologist. Her name is Wendy Lopez. And she told me on the way to see our first patient together, she said, when your child struggles to eat or breathe, these are the two scariest things you can experience as a parent. And that has really always just resonated with me as I've approached my work with the families that I see. This is such a challenging and stressful and scary thing if your child is struggling with feeding, because it really is so tied to their survival, just like breathing is. And I think as I've thought about it that way, I've really been able to see from an outsider's perspective as a provider and not as a parent of a child with feeding difficulties, to really start to understand why this is so scary and so challenging for parents. And Nicole, I know you had some thoughts you wanted to share here too.
Yeah, thank you. So feeding, like breathing, is also something that we just take for granted that will happen easily and naturally from the moment of birth with our children. And when it doesn't, it's really terrifying. And I can speak to my personal experience of watching my child start to wither away and noticing those really fundamental and profound visible bodily changes. There's really nothing like it. And it's certainly not anything I ever expected to witness. And it is accompanied by this tremendous sense of grief and guilt and sometimes shame, even if other people see what's happening and you don't necessarily have an explanation for it. So I just want to hold space for anyone here tonight who might be a parent or close loved one or caregiver of a child who has experienced this, and say, it is really hard, it is really terrifying, and I see you.
Okay. So we wanted to talk a bit about feeding diversity, because there's so much diversity in what feeding looks like for different children. Certainly children with other types of medical needs are more likely to have more of that kind of diverse end of the spectrum of feeding needs, but for all children, feeding looks different. And so this slide has a lot of information, and it's truly just the tip of the iceberg about the different ways that feeding can look and how complicated it can be. But we wanted to highlight some of that complexity because, again, it is a diversity. There's so many different ways that children can be nourished and can be fed, and it's so dependent on the child. So there are different routes through which children can eat, by mouth versus by a tube. But then even within tubes, there's so many different types of feeding tubes, different ways that food can be delivered through a feeding tube, different strategies for doing that. There are different types of food. Even I think at the most basic level, there's breast milk versus formula early in life is a decision that families make. And there are different choices that are right for different children. Even within, when you think about tube feeding, it's not as simple as just putting food through a tube. There's all kinds of different formulas or blended diets or all kinds of different ways that food can be different in terms of what we feed children and what's best for them. There can be all kinds of special supplies needed, ranging from special plates or utensils or tools that we help children eat with, to things like tubes or bags or buttons or syringes that we use with children who use tube feedings. A long list of potential medical specialists that may be involved in helping children with feeding, ranging from physicians to dietitians and psychologists, speech pathologists. The list can go on as kind of the complexity of feeding needs increases in terms of the number of providers that can be involved in this work. And really, feeding is often not just happening one way. It's a combination of strategies. And really, no two children have identical feeding needs. So what this boils down to is feeding is quite complicated and it's different for everyone. And there is so much diversity when we talk about feeding.
And within that diversity, I want every parent to honor wherever they are within this spectrum, because there's no right place to be, there's no wrong place to be, and the feeding journey is not linear. I find that it can be circular. You can revisit things that may have not worked in the past that you want to try again. It might look different than it did the first time, but I would encourage people to stay really open and curious to what this journey and this process can look like, and not assume that it's going to go from point A to B to C and so on until you end up sort of at where you wouldn't want to be. And as Blythe mentioned, I have been throughout this entire spectrum, breast to bottle to utensils to then G-tube, then J-tube, then PPN and TPN, and then back to J-tube, and all over the place. And I want to just be transparent and vulnerable and share that I wept at all of those stages, and it's never an easy decision. And wherever you are in this process, there's so much to grapple with. But I just want to reiterate that there isn't a right way or a wrong way to do this, and that every family is so different, and that you can change your mind repeatedly while you're on this journey. We have bounced around between blending our own formulas and getting commercially packaged ones more times than I can count. We've tried different formulas. We've tried just any number of things. I was so emotionally scarred from trying to breastfeed my daughter that I gave it a tiny little shot with my son, and I said, nope, this is really bringing up a lot for me, and I'm switching him to formula, and I'm not looking back. And that was one of the healthiest decisions I could have made. So wherever you land on this spectrum, wherever you're going next, know that you are making these decisions in the best interest of your child and your family, and it's okay. So I wanted to talk about some of the unexpected aspects of these diverse feeding needs that I've encountered, and maybe some of you can relate, and just again, honor these and hold space for them tonight. It is really hard if you go down the feeding tube route to say goodbye to your child's belly. I distinctly recall being in the waiting room for my daughter's G-tube surgery and kissing it and taking pictures of it, and my husband and I were crying, and it's just this perfect little part of her that was going to be changed. Now I love it, and I'm very intimate and familiar with it, and I think her button's adorable and her belly's adorable. She even has a colostomy now, and I still love her belly, but it's okay to be sad about that. It's hard. Having to go to the hospital and interrupt your day, or even in my case, many times a vacation, being out of town, going to a hospital you're not used to going to get a J-tube change, or that very first time that you change a G-tube because it pops out and you have to rush across town and the clinician freaks out and doesn't know how to do it, and so mom has to come help. Those things happen, and they're really hard, and it's okay that they're hard. They will get easier. Formula leaking out of a bag overnight. We call it feeding the bed. That's not a phrase I ever thought I would hear or know what it meant. It's happened, and it's stressful, and then you just clean it up and get through it. And the loss of the feeding journey that you expected, I think that there's such a grief that accompanies this that people don't talk enough about, of no one expects any of this for their kid. And as you stumble through it, each new step and phase, it's like, God, this is not what I wanted. And the title of tonight, harder than it should be. Like, it is so much harder than it should be. And no parent, no family, no child deserves this, but it kind of just is what it is. But also, it's okay to honor the loss of the journey that you expected. And then that judgment and unhelpful advice you will get from people inevitably about how you should be feeding your child. And I just want to reiterate that there is no right way or wrong way, and to stay within your own space and what feels right to your family and for your child. Move forward with the best intentions. Next slide, please. And this is Dana.
Okay. So we want to talk a little bit more about that emotional impact too, from what the research says. What have we found through lots of research? How does this impact parents and caregivers? There, over the last 20 years or so, has been quite a bit of research on understanding the parent experience when your child has complex feeding needs. And part of this research is quantitative, which means we, look at numbers and use statistical analyses. But part of it is qualitative, which means that we interview families, we ask them questions, and then we look together across different families. What are they saying that's in common? And we use that to understand parent experiences. There's been quite a lot of research when we're looking at understanding feeding and the impact on parents and caregivers. That emotional impact comes up time and time again. This is a quote from one of those qualitative studies from a parent who said, "I was in there and I'm going to get this kid to eat, and I sat there and I'd feed him. There was no bonding happening. I didn't bond with him for the first 3 months, even longer. I felt that it took me a long time to really, really bond with him because it was just always that stress of feeding." And there are so many other quotes out there just like this of parents really feeling like that feeding experience that they expected, that bonding that they expected, has been taken away, and there's grief with that, but that also just that active feeding has become so stressful for them. And this is such a common thing that parents and caregivers have reported. We also see that in general, parent stress is much higher when you're parenting a child with complex medical needs. There's a lot of research showing that parents of children with complex medical needs have much higher stress on a daily level than parents of children without complex needs. We did a recent study in our own feeding program looking at how many of our parents are experiencing mental health conditions and significant mental health needs. And we found that 40% of our parents endorsed that they had a significant mental health condition, which is much higher than the average rate for adults in the United States. And so we're really seeing that there is a lot of stress that parents and caregivers are experiencing when their children have complex feeding needs, and that is going to impact parent and caregiver well-being. There was a study done in 2011 that looked at the physiological effects of stress on caregivers of children with complex feeding needs. And they were looking specifically at parent cortisol, which is a stress hormone in your body, and how did that change when children were going through a feeding treatment and it switched from the therapist doing the feedings to the therapist asking the parent to feed their child and participate in feeding. And parent cortisol significantly increased when they started helping and started engaging in the feeding process as part of that therapy. Again, showing a direct biological stress response in caregivers as a result of that emotional and stress impact of feeding. So what we know is that there are a range of what I'd say inevitable emotions that come with feeding challenges with kiddos when you're a caregiver. There's fear involved, right? So when your child is struggling to eat or sustain themselves, or there are certain foods that they can't eat, and you have to worry about whether or not they're exposed to them, or whether or not the way that someone is feeding them in a different situation at school when they're at grandparents' house, if that's safe, that is really scary to go through as a caregiver, and that fear is normal. There's also sadness, right? So if something is not going well for your child, that is really hard to cope with, and that can make you feel a lot of sadness. And it can also make you feel angry, right? Anger is an emotion that we all experience when things are not the way that we want them to be or the way that we expected them to be. Nicole's talked a lot already about the grief that comes with a loss of what you expected for your child, a loss of that expected way that you were going to bond with your child. That's a really normal and inevitable emotion when you're experiencing feeding difficulties with your child. A lot of families report feelings of guilt. But then there's also these positive emotions too that I think are also inevitable. There is this joy when your child does something that maybe any other parent would not think twice about, but when your child does this, or when your child has a positive experience with a food or with feeding, that can feel really joyful, and that's a wonderful emotion to really focus on and sit with and get to experience that positive end of the emotions as well. And then of course, love, right? These challenges when your child struggles with feeding, it does not change how much you love your child, and that love that you share between them. That love and that joy exists at the same time as that fear and sadness and anger and grief and guilt, and they're all there together. It is not always easy, but those positive and those negative emotions really can coexist for a lot of the journey. Nicole, did you have other things you wanted to add here?
But I wish somebody would have told me that at the outset, that these can coincide, because I think that it's natural to fall into the more negative emotions and get stuck there. And I don't know. I think it took me a really long time in this parenting journey generally to accept the fact that I could have immense joy and love while I was also feeling those more negative things. And so I just wanted to thank Dana for kind of outlining this, and also just honor and recognize that some of you may be going through this, and that's totally normal.
Absolutely. So I wanted to touch briefly just on, ways that parents, I know we have parents and we have providers in the audience, but ways that parents and caregivers can take care of themselves in light of the stress and that range of emotions that come with having a child with feeding challenges. And really one of the most important things, and something that I talk to caregivers about all the time, is learning how to prioritize your self-care in whatever way that looks like for you. Because really, in order to take care of your child, you have to take care of yourself first. And in doing that, we talk a lot about checking in with yourself regularly, taking a moment to reflect on how you've been doing lately. If you've been doing well, that's fantastic. What's kept you feeling well? What can you keep doing that has been so helpful for you recently? But if you have been feeling overwhelmed, upset, or stressed, and those have been predominant emotions, what are some things that you might be able to do to feel better? Those things are different for everyone. And I think it takes some self-reflection to figure out what those things are for you. But thinking about things like taking time for yourself, even if it's just a few moments, asking for help and delegating when you can, talking with loved ones about how you're doing, doing the things that you enjoy, that bring you joy, nourishing your own body with food and water and exercise, taking your own medications, engaging in your own medical treatments, doing the things that you need to keep your body healthy. I think it's so easy when your child needs something and your child has complex needs to meet your child's needs first and forsake your own. But we don't function well without taking care of our own needs to nourish our own bodies. And so it's such a critical part of showing up for your child and showing up for yourself. Prioritizing your sleep as much as you're able. I know that that's such a very difficult thing to do for parents, but as much as you're able is, I think, the highlight there, and recognizing that it's okay to not be perfect. You will never be able to do everything right all the time, and that is absolutely okay. That is normal, and you're still a good parent.
Yeah, I can't stress enough how important all of this is to me. I mean, I've made it my professional goal to educate caregivers about how to take care of themselves, because I know firsthand how important it is and how much my children and family can suffer if I'm not putting myself at the center, which it took me a long time to reframe that for myself and not view it as selfish. And now I know that when I am underslept and undernourished and not talking about my emotions and naming them with clarity, everything sort of spirals, and then I am unable to provide the level of care that I want to and that my child needs. I will say on this last one, recognize it's okay to not be perfect. That is so huge. And one thing that's been really tremendously helpful for me is to reframe a lot of my negative emotions and thoughts, and also to adopt some mantras. Like just this morning, I was beating myself up about something that I felt like I failed at with my daughter. And I had to just the whole way to school say, it is not a moral failing that you didn't do that right. It is not a moral failing that you didn't do that right. And the feeding difficulties your child may be experiencing are not your fault. And it's important that you tell yourself that, and you tell yourself that often. I also want to add that this talking with your loved ones about how you're doing. I wrote in my own notes that sometimes if you're talking about feeding specifically, your loved ones aren't always necessarily your kind of safe space for that. If you're wanting to try something new, or you're not on the same page as your spouse about feeding, there can be so much turmoil and tension in some of those close relationships. And so I think it's important to identify who your safe people are and recognize that it might not be the people who you initially thought they would be. And it's okay to look outside that inner circle and find support on things like social media with other caregivers that you might connect with who are in your rare disease group potentially, or who know some of the challenges that you're facing. I also want to emphasize with social media that can be really damaging on the flip side. And so taking breaks from that, if what you're seeing is really unhelpful for the journey that you're on, or you're finding yourself constantly comparing your family's feeding journey with that of another family, again, to reiterate, no two families are the same and there's no right answer. So if you need a break from that constant stream of what everyone else is doing, take that break. You deserve it.
I completely agree. The other thing we talk a lot about is, paying attention to warning signs that you may be struggling more than kind of that typical level of struggling, such that you might need some extra help and extra support. So those warning signs to pay attention to are if your emotions get so big that they prevent you from being the type of person, parent, friend, or partner you want to be and are getting in the way of your life. If you've been a lot more irritable around loved ones, unable to enjoy things you normally enjoy, or feeling so overwhelmed that you can't get yourself started. Those are some common warning signs to be on the lookout for, and be monitoring and asking yourself, do I need some extra support? And when that does happen, when you start to notice any of those warning signs, and again, they may be those warning signs, or they may be, things that you've noticed and learned about yourself that are a warning sign, I would encourage you to ask for help. So there are a lot of different ways to ask for help. It can be talking with a loved one, but it can also be seeking out, some professional support or medical support. So talking to your own primary care doctor about options, considering looking for a therapist, a third-party mental health professional that you can talk to and can get you back on track and help you to feel well. We have a guide that's actually been posted on Courageous Parents Network on how to find a therapist. That's the link there. But if you go to the CPN website and go to the guide section, you'll see how to find a therapist as a guide there, and really walks you through, when you're a parent of a child with a medical condition, how do you find a therapist who's a good fit for you? Sharing your concerns with your child's care team. Many medical teams have a social worker or someone else on the team who can help you find resources for you and for taking care of yourself and your well-being. And so there can be a lot of support from reaching out to your child's medical team. And certainly in the event of a mental health emergency, calling 988, which is the National Suicide Prevention Hotline in the United States, or the crisis text line. And I know that was a really kind of quick summary of that emotional impact related to feeding challenges. But Nicole and I wanted to leave you with two main messages. The first being this one, and Nicole, I'll let you elaborate.
Sure. So this is so important to say out loud. There's power in nourishing your child how they need to be nourished. And something I was just talking with Dana about last night, said, don't let me forget to say this. I want to say how empowering alternative feeding choices can be. And by alternative feeding choices, I mean going for the G-tube going for the J tube, trying a liquid diet, whatever the case may be, that can give your family so much freedom back. It can give you this regained sense of control over what might feel like a really out of control, hopeless, helpless situation, and boost your self-esteem. It can make you feel more competent in your ability to provide this basic need for your child. And it can make you really proud of your parenting and what you've accomplished, proud of the fact that you've taken the next step, you've made that really difficult choice, but now you can rest assured that your child is getting what they need. There's power in nourishing your child how they need to be nourished. There's also joy in that. You can get your life back in a way that you never expected. I never expected that I would be kind of trapped in my house for a few years because I was spending hours a day feeding my kid. And that first outing after a tube and getting to just take the food with us and let it drip in however quickly it needed to or could, and just sitting back and not being like hovering and monitoring and micromanaging and stressing was so freeing. Such a powerful, joyful feeling. Your whole family can probably get out more, have less stress, and spend more time focusing on what brings your family joy. One quick example I'll give is my daughter used to eat quite a bit by mouth. Now she can only have really tiny tastes of things, and it's not the most safe, but we've kind of done the pros and cons and decided for her quality of life that we're going to allow her tastes. And she loves Indian food, particularly butter chicken, also ribs, also Kansas City barbecue, really strong, bold flavors that now I don't have to worry about how I'm going to get those things into her or whether I am at all, how much she's going to need or what that's going to look like or if she's going to choke or whatever. I can focus on the joy of her being so excited that her favorite meal is coming to the table, that she's squealing and kicking and beaming and she's radiant. She's so happy because she loves the food and the flavor that much. She's grabbing my spoon from me. She's taking that little lick. The little lick may be all she got, but that could make my entire day. So I just wanted to share a little joyful story and reiterate this statement here. Next slide, please. Great. And I will say, caregiver to caregiver, you matter. Your well-being is a priority for both yourself and your child. Again, my child has been through what I would consider essentially the full spectrum of feeding difficulty. And throughout that, I have had ebbs and flows of how I'm doing. And as Dana mentioned earlier, some of those warning signs, all of those warning signs I've had, and it does take a lot of strength to allow yourself to follow through and getting help, but it is the most important thing you can do. And even if you're not quite there, to just give yourself grace and patience and understand that your journey is your own and your child's and your family's, and that you're doing the absolute best you can.
I completely agree. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Oh, Blythe, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dan and Nicole, for that. You covered a lot of ground, and I myself have some questions, but before I treat myself to my questions, I wanted to see if some of our guests have questions that they want to ask. And if you do, please turn your camera on and raise your hand if you're comfortable asking the question, or pop it into the chat. Don't be shy. Okay, well, I'll go first. I am very curious. Nicole, you talked about when the parents are on different pages around feeding, and I would love to hear more about that, what you see, Dana, maybe what you see in the clinic, in your clinical work, Nicole, what you see in your parent-to-parent support that you do. I know for my own, I'll just say, when my husband and I, with our daughter Cameron, who had a very aggressive neurological condition that was for sure she was going to die. Like there was no treatment for what she had. We had opted for our daughter not to have a feeding tube because the neurological decline was so aggressive that we personally decided not to extend her life through tube feeding. But we went and saw a nutritionist at the suggestion of our daughter's pediatrician. This was sort of the one false move he made, I think. He was very supportive of our decisions and why we were making them, but he understood that she was not going to be tube fed. And yet he still sent us to a nutritionist. And that was a wrong move because the nutritionist looked at a 2-year-old who was this long and said she should be getting this many calories. Now, she didn't move at all. And so we came back from that meeting and my husband became obsessed with packing calories into her special bottle that she would drink. And she wasn't having any of it. She'd like do 3 sips and then she was like, I'm done. And he was really intense on trying to get her to get those calories. And I wanted to leave her alone because I felt like she was letting us know I took my 3 sips and now my jaw is tight. And it was probably one of the most stressful periods in our marriage of caring for her, was how insistent he was on feeding her and how upsetting I found his insistence. And so that really landed with me when you described that. So I've just shared something. I don't know if either one of you wants to add on to that about what you see and how you counsel couples when there is this thing. And I mean, ultimately we had a psychologist who helped us, but I'm just wondering what you would say about that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I know how difficult that is to talk about, so I appreciate your vulnerability. And I think that a lot of couples experience this. It's, again, like breathing, so fundamental to being alive that it's hard not to have really impassioned opinions about the best way to do it or whether to do it at all. I think if there are resources available to you as a couple to see a social worker or a psychologist, to have a neutral third party evaluate how you're talking to one another about those things, that can be tremendously beneficial, because I think we get really caught in communication styles and mishearing each other. And I think sometimes maybe a couple's ultimate goal for their child's quality of life does have a lot more overlap than they're realizing, but the pathway to achieve that goal is slightly different. And so that third party neutral that can just kind of help you navigate those pathways to reach that quality of life goal. I also think an excellent third party neutral is palliative care. And I was really afraid of palliative care because I thought, well, I don't think my child's dying yet. I don't think I need that. And when it was explained to me and reframed in this way of it's just supportive care, they were by far the most tremendous resource to both of us, because the way that those physicians can explain some of those decisions are ways that we never could have come to on our own. And without their support and their kind of not even guidance or coaching, just like super non-judgmental, just here's the facts, here's what this could look like, here's what this could look like, how are we going to line up here, was like mind-blowing and really changed a lot of conversations for us.
Thank you for that plug for palliative care.
Not
Yeah.
sponsored. No, and I totally agree with everything Nicole said. I think that was such a wonderful answer, and so great to hear that from your personal experience too, Nicole. The only thing I would add to is just thinking about and recognizing how emotionally laden these conversations and these decisions are. The things that we care the most about in the world are the things that hurt us the most in the world. And so when you're talking about decisions related to the quality of life for your child, that is always going to be one of the most emotional things that you can discuss and be making decisions about. And like Nicole said, most of the time parents have the same end goal, right? Their value is the same. What they want for their child is the same, is the best quality of life that you can have for your child. And no two people are going to look at the same exact situation and see it the same way. And so it really is about finding, how can you communicate? How can you get on the same page about how we reach our shared goal, while we're also both being mindful of the fact that we're talking about the most possible emotional topic that we can with our partner. And that is a really hard thing for anyone to do.
I love that, what you both said about bringing it back to what is your shared goal. And my husband and I definitely had the same shared goal. We were just coming at it two different ways. He thought he was helping her, and I thought he was driving her bananas.
Yeah. And it's hard to figure out. And I think at the end of the day, there's often never one right answer or one right way to do this. And so you just do the best you can, especially when you're thinking about kids. They can't always tell us what they want or what they need or how they feel. And so you're having to make the best possible decision you can for your child and your family based on the fact that you know them best. And again, that's never going to be easy, and no two people are going to see it exactly the same way. And yet you have to come to a decision anyways.
Does anybody else have a question or observation? Otherwise, I'll happily pop in with another.
I was just going to say, I'm thankful for the presentation and the conversation tonight, and the attention paid to just how sort of fraught these decisions are. Because when you think about, my husband and I are foodies, and so much of what we do for entertainment, right, revolves around feeding, whether it's going out as a family or social gatherings. And so there's a lot of emotional trappings that come with that. And Nicole, I appreciate all of your reminders to find the positive side of things. I think much like you, my journey took a while to see the positive things. And I see that in my fellow parent friends. I have a friend who's like, she would say she's a G-tube evangelist. She's like, all kids should have G-tubes. How do you keep a child hydrated who's sick, sort of thing. And like the G-tube is great for our kids in that instance, right? But this is making me think about a lot of things. I have the opportunity to teach in a couple of spaces, one through our care coordination project, and then also through our residency program, pediatricians. And one of the big things that we talk about with them is sort of checking in on coping, parent mental health, those sorts of things. And I'm thankful to learn of the Courageous Parent Network's How to Find a Therapist document. I'll be sharing that with them moving forward. But I'm curious what other strategies, those who've had experiences in sort of medical education, how are you approaching this subject and encouraging providers to ask about coping, right? We screen all parents, right, after the birth of a child, but we don't have this sort of global process to check in with parents who are raising kids with medical complexity and how they're coping. I'm curious if people have approaches or have processes where they're doing this really well that we can learn from.
Such a wonderful question, and one that I care quite a lot about. So in certain medical population, there are standards of care that specifically talk about checking in on parent, caregiver mental health and well-being. Pediatric oncology is a specific example where they have psychosocial standards of care. And one of those standards is specifically to address caregiver and family well-being and mental health in light of it having a child with a cancer diagnosis. There are a small handful of other medical conditions where there is a similar such standard of care, but it is a very small number of populations relative to the wide variety of medical complexity and children with different medical needs. And it's so challenging because there are logistical issues to navigate with regards to addressing parent or caregiver mental health in a pediatric often setting when they are not your patient. And so there's so many logistical things to think about that I think it makes it hard. And so when we're not always sure how to accomplish the goal, we don't always make as much progress. And thinking about resources, myself and a few colleagues, including Chrissy Sally, who works for Courageous Parents Network, have a paper under review where we have called for broader standards that would exist across children with complex medical needs that would specifically say we need to be screening for and addressing caregiver well-being within pediatric healthcare settings when we're working with children with medical needs. It is such a small first step towards a much larger systemic issue that I think will take a lot of different people coming together and a lot of brainstorming to figure out how could we actually make that happen. I know in small ways, both Nicole and I have done some medical education. We just did a telementoring echo series in the state of Kansas for community providers focused on supporting caregivers of children with medical conditions. So we've done some things locally, but I think there's so much work to do to really make this standard of care for all children with complex medical needs, because that's really what we need. This is a conversation that needs to be had with all caregivers of children with medical needs.
Thank you for sharing. I'm excited to hear that there's a paper like that. It may be a small step, but it's a step forward, right? And this is a critical area of need. And I know we've struggled with that. How do we address that? Knowing that there's all those complexities, not being the patient, right? But even our approach has been so far to encourage them to then, connect with parent-to-parent resources in the state, like to still talk about it, even if you can't provide direct care, or to encourage a parent to have a conversation with their primary care doctor. I know I wasn't having that conversation in the primary care space. I think partly because I didn't yet know that many of the feelings and worries I had were normal.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought that they were a reflection on me as a mother, and I didn't want to share them with anyone.
Yeah. And again, that's so true, because it's not reflected in the media that we consume, right? This popular experience. It's something that often feels really isolating when you're going through it. And it's not until you connect with other caregivers who've experienced something similar and have those conversations and build a community, or have a conversation with a provider if they are, paying attention to those things that we really know is normal. I talk all the time about, I'm a psychologist and I'm trained to do all kinds of things to help people deal with stress and anxiety and depression and post-traumatic stress. But to be quite frank, I think one of the most impactful things I am able to do is just tell someone that their emotions are normal, which is not something you need a PhD to be able to tell other caregivers.
I was just going to add my little piece to this. As a clinician, I'm trying to hang back, but this is really thought-provoking. But I do think that you're hitting the nail on the head with trauma-informed care. I think, having worked in the hospital, and now I work in a specialized school setting with children with really complex medical needs, that we sometimes forget that our families and the families that we serve have really been through a lot of situations that would be described as situations that provoke post-traumatic stress disorder. And we aren't addressing that. We come at them with a lot of ideas of what we want them to do without saying, where are you now? What can we do to support you? Is this the right time for us to address this issue? If not, what can we do in the meantime to put a temporary hold on this, to keep you safe, to keep your child safe, till we can find a time that's right to address this? Because not every family is ready to embark on a big feeding journey all the time. And that can be a huge challenge. I was in a hospital setting, in a clinic, where people came to us for feeding support. It's very different from a specialized school setting where your child has feeding needs and we should discuss them and address them. And they're like, that's not why we're here. So it's a huge difference, and you kind of have to take a step back and say, okay, where are you and where can I support you now? So
absolutely.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
And I think a huge part of this is just how important it is for caregivers to feel validated. Like you said, Holly, I don't think we could do all the medical education in the world and present and say, here's the resources that you should be connected to. Here's how you should talk to parents, when really all they need to hear is, like when I introduced myself and I told you my story with Dana, it literally changed my life. That a provider just said, how are you? 3 words. Nobody had ever asked me that though. And however many appointments I had been to with my child, it was, how is she? What's next? What are you doing? How's she eating? What she did? And I broke down in tears when somebody asked me how I was doing. I didn't even need all of the resources in that moment. And like you said, Marian, I said this in a webinar to childcare providers in Kansas on Thursday. Like, there's not every family is going to be in the same place at the same time, right? So they could have just experienced so much trauma that they are physiologically incapable of hearing what you're telling them. And so maybe taking a pause and revisiting that conversation. And in the meantime, it can go so far to just say, I see you. What you're feeling is totally normal. And I did have my primary care doctor immediately refer me to a mental health specialist, someone who's on staff as kind of like emergency, I think. And I went from my primary care appointment down the hall to see her. And I'll never forget that 45 minutes I spent there, because that was life-changing. And for what I'm doing at KU, I mean, talking to first-year undergrad med students about the rare disease patient experience and family experience, and just saying, I just want to draw it to your attention that this is what families experience, and it's so much bigger than just the symptoms that show up in your clinic. So just starting the conversation.
Oh, you're muted again, Blythe.
Sorry, all the invisible stuff that parents carry around with them. And I was thinking, Nicole, you brought up the thing about social media. You know, I am really glad. I think social media has a lot of benefits. I mean, we know the good, and we also know the perils. And I'm just going to say that if I had been going through my journey with my daughter, Cameron, who we were not tube feeding and was declining because her disease was so aggressive, and I had been following people who were celebrating all the ways they were getting their child to eat, I don't know what would have happened to me. It would have been really, uh, uh, it, I know that the part of me that wanted to feel like I was being a good parent would have suddenly had a giant crisis of confidence and conviction. And, um, and it would have fragmented me, and then it may have fragmented me and my husband, because we were very aligned about the decision we made. We were just not aligned about how we were going to get her to eat as much as she could orally. And I really worry I worry for parents who see a lot of things because nobody puts on social media how they're struggling in a way that somebody else can tolerate. So what you're seeing is all the victories, and that's great, but what about for the parents who are not having victories, right? So I love that you named that.
Yeah, I can say that I took a huge break because of that. I got really active in social media for a while because it was such an easy place to find community. My daughter was the 36th confirmed case globally with her disorder. And so in those early days, I was so desperate for connection, and I found it. And I can say some of my closest friends now, honestly, it sounds crazy, but even the ones that I haven't met in person or that I've met one time at a conference or something, I just feel such a kinship with. And in that way, it's been such a safe space. And then it reached this point for me where I was like, I cannot get on here without either sobbing or hating myself or judging someone else. To your point, like, I found myself judging other people's choices too, not even worried if they were judging mine, but being like, I would never do that. And then I was like, that's a gross thing about me that I don't like, and I don't want to continue. And so just like, it took a lot for me to get off, because I had made such a community there, and I wanted to see how other people's kids are doing and how they were doing. And I just finally was like, I can't. I will revisit it in a season of my life when it makes more sense to me. And now I just kind of hop on and off when it feels mentally, emotionally healthy to do so. But it's not an easy thing to decide.
Well, I think what this is talking about is how if what we're saying is how important it is to be validated in your emotions and your feelings, and then whatever choices you make, whatever those may be. And social media is a perilous place. Then all the more reason that validation needs to happen in the more intimate clinical setting, or the peer-to-peer support that is a more managed situation. And all the more reason for the clinicians to bring awareness of this and to explicitly name it and ask how parents are doing. And what I would say for parents to come to the clinician and say, I am struggling with this, right? And really, like, if CPN does nothing, if CPN can have played a role in validating the struggle and encouraging you to bring it to your child's caregiver or your own person and say, I'm struggling, can you help me? Like, it is healthy, it's normal to struggle with this. Yeah, so to ask for help.
For sure.
Parent, or to ask if the person needs help, if they're a clinician. I'm aware of the time. Does anybody have anything they want to observe, ask? We're lucky to have Nicole and Dana with us. And those of you who are here to have yours. Oh, Kathy, please, your hand is raised. Yes.
I have a tendency to ask questions at the end of each session. I think that's the last session too. I'll make it short. I do wonder if you have any comments on how parents can model remain calm, or be a good example for their kids when the kids struggle, whether they puke, they couldn't tolerate the feed, because it's very stressful for the parents, but also the parents need some tools to help their kids to cope. I wonder if you have any comments on that.
I'm so glad you asked, because we haven't been talking about the experience for the child. I'm so glad you asked that.
Same. Dana, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm happy to. It's a great question. It is, you know, I often have parents who talk to me about the fact that they don't want to show negative emotions in front of their kids, or show that they're upset or scared or worried, or angry, right? And feel really guilty when they show those emotions in front of their children. And I do think it's important, you know, to take care of yourself and take care of those emotions. But what we know is that it's important to show our kids that we also have a full range of emotions, but then model how we cope with it. So it's not that you can never be nervous or scared or sad or angry in front of your children. It's that we need to also show them how we take care of ourselves, how we deal with those feelings, so that they can learn that it's one, okay for them to experience those same feelings, and two, this is how I might be able to help myself, and it's important that I do something to help myself. And so when it comes to those stressful, you know, experiences with feeding, and when children are struggling, I think it's important to validate, you know, I know that this is really frustrating. I know that you're angry. I feel angry sometimes about this too. It's really hard. And it's normal to feel that way. And this is what I'm doing right now to take care of myself when I feel that way. I am going to, you know, maybe that's take some deep breaths. Maybe it's okay if we take a break. Maybe it is, you know, something nice that I'm going to do for myself this evening, because I know it's been a really hard day and we've both had to work really hard today. You know, whatever that is for you. And I think it's different for different people, but having a conversation with kids, letting them know that those emotions are normal, being willing to share your emotions with your kids, but always following that up with showing them that you value taking care of yourself, so that they learn to value those things for themselves too. But it is really, really hard. And, you know, a lot of the work that I do is helping parents too, in managing those really big and challenging emotions that happen while you're feeding your child, when feeding is the most stressful thing about your day. And that feels really challenging. And, you know, helping to try to take some of the pressure off of yourself of, you know, it's never going to be perfect. We're focused on the things that are in our control, and we're going to do the best that we can. We're going to, you know, meet our child where they're at and follow what we know are their needs. And it's okay if this meal isn't perfect. And again, using some of those strategies that we we've learned to help cope with difficult emotions in real time. But again, I think it's okay to show your kids those emotions as long as you're also showing them that you know, what you're doing to help yourself.
I fully agree with that. And I also,
Yeah.
Okay, just really quickly. Naming the emotion I have found helpful, and also then telling my child that it's not because of her that I'm feeling that way, but it's because of the situation. So being really specific about where the strong emotion comes from. So if I'm giving her a med and the other end of the extension pops open and the med goes flying everywhere and I lose 3 precious milliliters and I shout the F word immediately, which has maybe happened, saying, gosh, I'm so frustrated that your med just flew across the room. That really made me angry. I'm not mad at you at all, but man, that sucked. Or say, like, if feeding is really hard and we're having a really challenging time, or she's really struggling to swallow, and I do have the luxury of having a child who can understand verbal language very well. So I know that's not the case for everybody, but just acknowledging that we're in it together and that it can suck and that it's okay. So, man, your swallow seems really unsafe right now. That must be really frustrating for you. I'm frustrated too. This sucks. What can we do instead? And just being like really honest and transparent. I wear my heart on my sleeve, and she's seen me run the full range of those emotions, and I just try to follow it up. There are times when I express it too strongly, or I have days in a row where I can feel it ramping up, and then I am kind of out of control of those strong reactions. And that's then another clue to myself to kind of reevaluate. What do I need to take care of myself so I can stop having those like big explosive emotions? But I think if they're just in the moment, genuine reactions to stressful things, naming that that's what's happening, and also reassuring your child that it's not their fault, that that's why you're feeling that way.
This is making me wonder. This was not my case, and this is probably not the case. I mean, this is not the case for a significant number of families, like for parents of children with very severe neurological impairment issues. But for those parents for those children who are cognitively aware of what's happening and do appreciate and can express their appreciation for the pleasure of eating or feeling hungry. And do you have scripts or guides for managing the conversation when feeding by mouth is difficult, or now where it's become so difficult that we are actually going to supplement or replace almost entirely with tube feeding? Like, are there scripts for that so the child doesn't feel like this is an indication that they're failing in some way? I wonder about that.
It's a great question. I don't know of any out there that exist. I know I've been a part of some of those conversations. Nicole, I know that you've certainly been a part of those, but yeah, I'm not sure if there are any that exist out there.
Yeah, I don't know of any specific scripts from my personal experience. I'm only speaking as myself, but I'm just really honest with my kid and tell her what's next and why it's happening, and acknowledge what will be hard about it, but also what will be good about it, and encouraging her to hold space for 2 emotions at the same time, and just trying to model. And it's never perfect and it's always messy, but marching forward.
Well, thank you both, Dana and Nicole, for your time tonight. Thank you, everybody who is here, who listened so carefully, thoughtfully, who shared. I really want to, I thank you both, all of you. I'm now going to stop the recording.